Hello, thank you for joining us this evening. We are recording. If you were unable to join us for the previous events, my name is Henry Smith. I am Operations Manager here at Filipino Advocates for Justice, or FAJ for short. Virtually hosting from unceded Ohlone territory, commonly known as Oakland, California. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, your names, pronouns, and where you're Zooming from today. Since 1973, FAJ's mission is to build empowered Filipino community by organizing constituents, providing services, and advocating for social justice and equity. We continue to do the hard but important work for our community. So please stay engaged by donating to us, joining our mailing lists and socials, as well as volunteering when opportunities arise. We turn 50 next year, so look out for our event announcements. And just as FAJ is turning 50, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the declaration of martial law in the Philippines. This is our third and last installment of our series to commemorate the declaration of martial law. Before we get started, I just wanted to cover some community guidelines. For tonight's forum, we are excited to have our featured speakers here and following that by a Q&A session. We ask that everyone remains muted unless prompted to speak during the Q&A portion. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will collect them to be answered among some of the previously submitted questions. We will do our best to get through all the questions, but in honoring of all of our time, not all of the questions may be answered by the time our time together ends. We aim to provide a safe space to discuss what might be some sensitive topics to some or all of us. So please remember to be respectful, and be kind to each other as well as ourselves, and to listen openly and mindfully to each other. Please take care of yourselves. If you need to take a breath or step away, please do so. But we do have a scheduled break after the first two speakers. And without further ado, I would like to invite our Executive Director, Geraldine, to offer some opening words. Geraldine?
Thank you, Henry. Hello, everyone. Just catching up on the chat. We've got a lot of people here from different parts of the world, it sounds like. Thank you for this opportunity to convene our community in this way. I see our youth, I see our elders, I see our elders from so many places here. Magandang tanghali po. Kamusta po tayong lahat? My name is Geraldine Alcid, and I am the current steward and executive director of Filipino Advocates for Justice. I do want to shout out to my predecessor, mentor, and friend, Lillian Galedo, who I know is on this call. Lillian was our ED and leader for over 37 years, and send some love towards Lillian if you can. Martial law is a sensitive and personal topic. In last week's screening, we watched Kingmaker, and it was said, those who don't know their history are destined to repeat it. But I am from a generation whose parents deliberately kept that history hidden. I immigrated with my family to the US in 1976 at the age of 2, the youngest of 4 children. It confused me as a child, this place called the Philippines. My elder siblings were already in their teens, and I liked to listen to them talk when they'd let me around them. Apparently in the Philippines, we had a huge family. We had katulong and yayas and a very comfortable life over there. But here, my siblings had no social life. They did the laundry poorly and watched me after school. My parents were both CPAs. I think my father was a bank inspector for the Philippine Central Bank. My mother ran a dress manufacturing business. Both would never reach beyond a bookkeeper in the US. I would watch my family wax nostalgic about life back home and then turn around to navigate poverty, crime, casual racism, a loss of status and dignity in our lives in Chicago by comparison. And I never understood why they would leave the land with the sweetest fruits. I didn't yet have the eyes to see it back then, but we went through a deep and literal severing from our families, from the land, from the language, but especially from the politics and the memories. I wouldn't actually know until adulthood that I had an entire side of my family in the resistance, that my mother was arrested, my uncle disappeared, and that all prompted our family leaving. Nagpapasalamat po ako sa mga magulang ko. I call out my parents, Flor and Tony. How dark did it have to be for them to uproot and move so far away? My parents are no longer alive, yet I want to honor them and the choices that they made to survive. While we recognize the severance, it must not be an erasure. And we are here to reclaim our stories and our truths, despite the trauma. This is why I am humbled and grateful for this panel and our panelists, Ben, Jojo, Carol, and Rene, and very grateful for you to be here today. I also want to just say thank you to Santi, our moderator tonight, for your vision of this 3-part series and dedication, and to the FAJ team who have planned these events. Salamat po. Thank you.
Okay. Magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Susan Santi Buensuceso. I am a worker organizer at FAJ, and I am the moderator for this afternoon's discussion. I would like to start out by saying that to keep the memory of martial law alive, its survivors have been compelled to embark on a renewed and oftentimes painful struggle in order not to allow the ascent of another Marcos into the presidency, not to allow that to eclipse the truth about martial law. We are doing this because we need to understand that the past is part of what is happening to the Filipinos right now. What we have become and why. And I think one of the most important parts of what has happened to the Filipinos is that it has become a nation of OFWs and migrants like us. And we have been scattered all over the world. So martial law was characterized by exacerbated poverty, human rights violations, and the systematic plundering of our economy. So having said that, I would like to call our first speaker. He is a personal friend of mine. He is currently a professor at the University of Hawaii. Please welcome Professor Patricio Jojo Abinales.
Hello. Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. Thank you for the Filipino Advocates for Justice for this invitation. Thank you, Susan, for inviting. The last time I saw Susan was in Avenida when the police was throwing this, suddenly the fire trucks were spewing this liquid with red dye designed to scare demonstrators off because it had a sight of blood, but also easier for the plainclothes men to arrest people. So the last time I saw Susan was in 77, Susan, oh? And there she was, egging us all to continue fighting while her shirt was full of red dye. So of course, we were not as brave as her, so we ran faster. And so it's a great time. Listen, thank you for inviting her, because this is the second time. It's the only time I've seen Susan again. So she's not Santi to me. She's always Susan, and will always be the Susan, the person in front of every demonstration, the firebrand who would force us to continue marching and giving the finger to the fascist police. So what I'd like to do in the 20 minutes that you guys have given me is to do something that I usually do with my students when we reach the period of martial law. A lot, as you know, big portion of the students in the University of Hawaii, Manoa, are Filipinos, and most of them are actually as puzzled as you are as to say when they say, "Well, my mom came here, but doesn't want to talk about where they came from." Last semester, I had a student who say, "I think my father was a guerrilla." Like, okay, go ask your father about it. And the dad said no. So what I usually do with them is to say, in 20 minutes, can you discuss martial law with your parent, and then ask them by the time you have dessert on where they saw themselves. So what I'd like to do is 20 minutes of an overview of martial law. Okay, so my daughter taught me how to share screen. Okay, and you probably get bored with my face. So here goes. Okay, please start. Can you guys see that, Mrs. Marcos, in Hawaii? Okay, so I assume you can see that. So the Marcos dictatorship. There are two things. When you talk of martial law, most of the time, people who remember martial law remember it in terms of only one event, which is the suppression of 30,000 people. The arrest led to all this, imposition of martial law, the military all over the place, forced silence in big cities. But as somebody who grew up in Mindanao from the South, this is also how I remember martial law. That a year after Marcos declared martial law, our Muslim brothers went to war. And went to war to a point that by early 1975, they almost captured the city of Cotabato and actually seized the city of Jolo. So they were so entrenched in Jolo such that the Philippine Navy had to bomb the hell out of that town, burn it like in Vietnam, so that to drive them on National Liberation Front away. So for me, martial law is always the silence in the University of the Philippines. When we went back there and saw Marines pointing their machine guns at us, but the other side of me being from Mindanao is to, see two of my friends killed in this war. See my cousin who was a lieutenant in the Philippine Military Academy, had his baptism of fire in the middle of nowhere in Cotabato, but also a lot of my Muslim friends eventually being involved in the Moro National Liberation Front, which I'll come back later. Now, the next question to ask is, why was it successful? Well, martial law had three foundations. First was, of course, the armed forces of the Philippines, which saw the threat of a re-establishment of the Communist Party, the growing unification of different Muslim groups in the South, and also the systematic attack on Marcos as an attack on itself. Second, it was very worried about the South, especially after news came that the Malaysians and eventually the Libyans were willing to give arms to our Muslim brothers. Marcos was also starting to do this, which worried a lot of people. But from the military side, it was a cachet that, a potential cachet for them, which he would take advantage of. The second group were the technocrats, American educated economists and business leaders, most of them Ivy Leaguers, who were recruited by Marcos as early as 1964 on the pretext that he would just watch them govern the Philippines. Now, if you know any economists, most economists and business people, they're almost always anti-politicians. So anti-politician, they were anti-Congress because they thought Congress was just a bunch of local yahoos who are pursuing their own interests and very corrupt. They were anti-oligarchy because they thought family monopolies like the Lopezes in ABS-CBN, the sugar interest, family Lopez who also controlled the sugar industry, were an anathema to capitalism, but they were also very selective. and they were anti-political. And like Marcos, they shared the idea that to governance in the Philippines has to be done by professionals, apolitical professionals with the engineering and economic skills to turn the country around. The third bill that Marshall, and this is actually this talked about, is the middle class, your parents. Okay. By the late 60s, there was protests in the streets, but it was not only a protest against the government, it was a protest against a generation, your grandparents pala, who were pro-American, who lived in the 50s, extremely stabilized, very anti-communist, very pro-US Cold War. It was so the youth, the protesting youth, Rene Ciria-Cruz, for example, they were seen as people who were going to destabilize a search for a Philippine Eden. So when Marcos declared martial law, Marcos turned to them and said, look, the instability caused by your children will be over. We're going to go back hunky-dory. We're going to stabilize the country and move towards development. So a big foundation of Marcos, success of Marcos, was Filipino middle classes saying, now the streets are clean. Now our children have haircuts. Now they're not smoking marijuana. Now they're not protesting in the street. And good God, they're not joining the New People's Army. Okay. So those are the three bases of support. But Marcos then promised that he would build a new society. So what was his target? There are three important things, sources of support for Marcos. First, he would continue what other presidents have done, which is open up. If you're familiar with the theory of economic comparative advantage, Marcos said, well, our strength are our agricultural resources. So if we sell it in the world market in a systematic way, I'm sorry, I have an allergy, then we will be able to, compete with other third world countries, but also ensure that you have safe markets, open markets in Japan, in the Middle East, but also keep our market in the US. So apart from sugar and tobacco, which are the traditional, coconut sugar and tobacco, which were the traditional exports to the Philippines, Marcos did two things. He opened up Mindanao and opened Mindanao to export crops. And this is a picture of Davao del Norte, where in huge swatches of fertile lands in Davao del Sur, Davao del Norte, and Cotabato were leased out to American transnational corporations growing pineapples, bananas, and later on vegetables, aimed for the Japanese, the Middle East, and eventually the Korean and Chinese market. These were lands that were public lands and ergo lands but also lands that were not subjective to land reform. The other thing that Marcos did was to initiate a limited land reform program in the rice industry to placate, one of the biggest, the peasants, because rice, peasant tenancy was always a big problem in the Philippines. The Hooks in the 1950s rebelled against it. So Marcos said, I'm going to institute land reform. I'm going to give back to the landless, but only for rice. The other lands, sugar, devoted to sugar, tobacco, but also to bananas and pineapple, would be devoted to corporations having partnership with American corporations and selling to the global market. Okay. We stayed 4 months in Davao to study this. The other thing was this. Marcos then goes to foreign investors, Japanese and American, and say, we will guarantee you the Philippine side of the investments. Let's go into joint ventures. So by 75, 76, a UP University of Philippines College of Law study, there was a remarkable rise in what they call joint ventures between Japanese, American corporations and Filipino partners. The biggest partner was, of course, the Philippine government through what they called the government corporations. Okay, the third source of wealth of revenue is this. Marcos then turns to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and says, we are going to open up the economy to global trade. Give us money. Help us with this. And if you remember the book by Walden Bello on the development debacle, where Walden and a bunch of other people in San Francisco sneaked into the World Bank office and stole a lot of documents to write the book. That was it. And the second source of foreign support was, of course, the US military. Marcos knew that the Americans were always paranoid with their bases. So he would use that. He would use supposed nationalism as a guard bargaining point. So every time, say in the Carter era in 1977, when Jimmy Carter said, well, human rights is an important thing, Marcos would just dangle and say, it's time to negotiate the basis, and basically force the Americans back to the negotiating table. Okay. The interesting thing here, actually, for future research is no one has done any accounting as to where the money went, even up to now. Okay. So that's the second source of economic development by Marcos, especially in the late 70s, when the sugar industry began to founder and the coconut industry also experiencing a decline, were three areas where people, okay. The first in around 75 to 77, where the first Filipino workers who went to Saudi Arabia to help build Saudi cities, because the Saudis had enough money because of the oil increase in 73 to quote unquote modernize the city. So Filipinos began, males mainly, initially males mainly went to Saudi Arabia, worked as blue-collar workers, initially building towers that you see now in Dubai, etc. And they became known as the Katas ng Saudi. Okay, so meaning they bring back the Jews from Saudi Arabia. So the joke in my hometown, for example, if somebody comes in, we would always say in design, "Hoy, patilawa katas sa Saudi," which is, hey, can you give us a taste of the Jews from Saudi? By the late 70s, however, the Japanese government realized that their salarymen were overworked and alienated, and opened up sex tours all over Southeast Asia. The target being Thailand and the Philippines, where Marcos then says, let's export women to the bars. Instead of the Japanese coming in, maybe we can, we can hit the two birds in one stone. Okay, send our women there, get jobs, and then they can remit money back. So in the 80s and most of the 90s, when you go to Tokyo, there's a lot of these bars, especially in places like Shinjuku, where Filipinas were the main draw. Okay. Eventually, that evolved into a mail order bride business, which I can talk about later. The third one, by the mid 70s, were the Filipinos. Again, note that the middle class were pro-Marcos. Okay? The lure of immigration, which I think you guys can more talk about it. Now, from the perspective of Marcos, it was interesting because how do you keep some of these noisy children of the middle class from joining the communists or joining underground? You tell mom and dad to move to the United States, taking advantage of the looseness, the relaxation of immigration laws. So that's one thing actually that hasn't been studied, primarily because none of the parents or grandparents of you guys here want to talk about it. But from the side of Marcos, it was really say, okay, this is one way of depleting any possible, depleting any possibility of our young people join the underground, join the opposition, and join the New People's Army. Okay, so what happened then? The third important thing, of course, is this. Okay? People tend to forget that martial law was not only a political move or an economic process of a promise of an older golden age. It was also the promise of a new society. Okay, so Marcos really, said, and Mrs. Marcos especially thought they were going to rebuild the Philippines and create what Imelda would call the City of Man. Okay, the City of Man, which would have, among other things, and this is what Imelda told my professor from Cornell, which would include a plastic dome where the Philippines would be protected from Russian missiles, Soviet missiles, because the missiles would just bounce off the plastic dome. And she would try to talk to my professor and say, you know what, if the United States adopt this, the plastic dome, the Cold War will be over. Okay. But it's not only that. She imagined in City of Man where everything had followed a certain color design. So I remember vividly in 1979, we went to Davao City to do a research in the banana industry. People complaining that Imelda visited Davao once and said, well, I want orange colors for the street, red colors for the street, yellow for the street. And now you understand why Davao, apart from Manila, was one of the first cities to protest after Benigno Aquino was assassinated. So she wanted to redo that. She actually wanted to become president of the University of Philippines on the grounds that she would like the University of the Philippines professors, especially in political science, to create an ideology for her husband. So my dean, Dean Francisco Nemenzo, was among the deans invited by Imelda in '76 to Malacanang, was being harassed by Imelda, who kept saying, Professor Nemenzo, I know you're an ideologue. Can you make an ideology for my husband? And Professor Nemenzo said, I was caught between the single malt and Mrs. Marcos harassing me. So I kept explaining to her that you cannot make an ideology while downing her single malt. Okay. The second one is this. Okay. In 1975, Marcos invited a couple of historians from the University of the Philippines to write, supposedly without any obstruction, the real history of the Philippines. Okay. They were paid like $4,000 pesos in '75, and they spent most of the time in the National Archives and teach people like us to create this national history. So Tadhana has its own story. There's a young Filipino teaching now in Brunei who wrote his dissertation on Tadhana, and it's an interesting history because it's an attempt to say the Philippines had a civilization before the Spaniards came, and the acme of that civilization was Miss Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, the father and the mother of the Filipinos. Okay. The third one was this, and the result of this guy, General Jose Almonte, is one of those interesting fellows who started his career as a member of the military intelligence, fought in Vietnam, they close to President Ramos, but during martial law was asked by Marcos to create an ideology. And that institution became the Philippine Center for Advanced Studies in the University of the Philippines, which Marcos created and imposed on the university, which we consider was a parasite and a blot in the university's reputation. So their business was to create an ideology and spread it and introduce and orient Filipinos, especially those living abroad, about it. Okay. So we cannot forget that. And of course, the 30,000 pairs of shoes of Mrs. Marcos was really part of it. For her, like, it's beauty. If you remember Kingmaker, she said, I want beauty to be experienced by most Filipinos. And so the 30,000 pairs of shoes were that. Okay, so what happened then? The other thing is that not all Filipinos kept quiet. And as I said earlier, when you talk of martial law, you don't only talk of silence and repression, you also talk of resistance. And the most important organization that first resisted and actually threatened Marcos was the Moro National Liberation Front, headed by this guy, Norm Misuari, who was a political science professor, graduate at the University of the Philippines, taught at the Asian Studies, and then suddenly disappeared. The Moro National Liberation Front wanted to separate Mindanao and the island of the Sulu Archipelago and the island of Palawan from the Philippines on the grounds that Muslims never considered themselves Filipino. It's very fascinating because in 2008, you still have that strong sentiment. Okay, what made MNLF strong were a couple of things. One, it's the first time that different Muslim ethnic groups united. The Maguindanaos, the Tausugs, the Maranaos, the Bilaan, the Samals. For the first time, these ethnic groups, who sometimes do not understand each other, a Maguindanao can hardly understand a Maranao, came together. The different classes, traditional elites, royals, middle class, poor, also united and agreed to join the Moro National Liberation Front. What gave them the firepower are these two countries. Okay, Malaysia, who was still bruising over Marcos's attempt to infiltrate a guerrilla army into Sabah to initiate a resistance supposedly that would bring Sabah back to the Philippines, and Libya, whose leader Muammar Gaddafi was convinced by Misuari that there was genocide happening in the southern Philippines. So Libya then agrees to train the first 200 fighters of the Moro National Liberation Front. I interviewed one of them, fascinating story. And Malaysia said, we'll set up camps in Sabah and Borneo for your army to train. And they would then But so it was quiet from 72 to 74, and then in 74, the Moro National Liberation Front launched a series of offensives that, as I said earlier, almost captured Cotabato, captured Jolo, such that they had to burn it. And so my cousin, who was a captain, a lieutenant in that war, he said, you know, we were outgunned and even out toilet paper, you know, because the rebels were supplied by Libya and the Malaysians, according to my cousin, with from guns to toilet paper. The Libyans and the Malaysians were subsidizing them. I met two Malaysians actually in Monterrey, who, as young lieutenants, they said were flying helicopters down south. It's a fantastic story. The interesting thing is that the MNLF actually stopped the Marcos dictatorship from consolidating itself, because it had to spend $1 million a day to try to contain an army that was fighting like the way the Japanese and the Americans fought in World War II. The MNLF was the second conventional war that the Philippines underwent. The first one was World War II. And it diverted 90% of the military to Mindanao, leaving the police attempting, and the constabulary attempting to repress the other parts of the country. And that's what have an impact on what would happen to human rights, but also the emergence of RAM. The MNLF would fight the government for 2 years and split. And the split is another story. But one of the largest split happened in 78 with the formation of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, headed by this guy who was a graduate of Al-Azhar University in Egypt, Hashim Salamat. Hashim Salamat, the MILF, were in favor of separatism, but they thought that the MNLF was too secular, too controlled by Ibiswari, who was a graduate of UP, who was influenced by communists. Okay? And so they insisted that the Moro struggle take an Islamic form. And it was reinforced by the fact that Salamat's main commanders, the guys who are reading BARMM now, experienced their first war fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. So they were veterans of the Afghan War. There were Islamic scholars coming out, not only from Egypt, but places like Iran, Syria, and therefore saw a more politicized Islam as the way for the Philippines to grow. Okay, they had close ties with Malaysia, and there's a very fascinating story behind that. But the interesting thing about it is why the MNLF eventually split. The MILF, up until 1996, still had a powerful 14,000 army. And they would outlast Marcos and the MNLF. Can talk about that later. The third opposition group was the Communist Party of the Philippines, inspired by what was happening in China, the thoughts and writings of Chairman Mao Zedong. It was student-led. Okay? I think Rene can talk to more about it. Why they became, why people like them in the 70s were inspired by Mao Zedong. He can talk about that. One of the things that inspired them about Mao Zedong was to fight a guerrilla war against the Philippine military, similar to what the Chinese did in the late 40s and led to the victory of Mao in 1949. Many people argue that these young people, the Communist Party unlike the old Communist Party, this party became a nationwide phenomenon. And the reason for this is this. As the military expanded, as the military spread, and as the constabulary and the police took over the task of policing the Filipinos, militarization and human rights abuses, which we talked about now, were pushing people to the side of the communists, including churches. Okay, so in Mindanao, for example, the one reason why the Communist Party expanded so fast in Mindanao was communities were going to the parishes and going to the nunneries and saying, protect us from the military. So inevitably, a lot of the clergy back in the South became politicized. I could remember my Columban nun sisters before martial law were very strict. They whacked us in the butt, Sister Mary Clement and all. And then to see them transform by the late 70s, when you come back for alumni reunions, removing their uniforms and actively talking about human rights. The church was instrumental in forming up social action centers, human rights centers, and using the churches themselves to protect these people. Inevitably, a lot of the priests said, God has also one way of, God has given us the right also that when people are oppressed, we fight with them. So in a very strange way, especially in Mindanao, there's a combination of theology of liberation and Maoism, which led to the expansion of the party. The party was 1 million strong and the even martial was declared, but as I can explain later, by the 1980s, I think one of you mentioned about sectarian politics, the party began to unravel. Actually started in 77 and in 80, 86 was the culmination. I'll talk to you guys about it if you have questions. So what happened? By the 1970s, in 1974, the Philippines, for the first time in its history, experienced a positive balance of trade. But by 1977, these two important exports declined. Sugar, because Marcos monopolized it through his crony, Benedicto, and they thought that if they withhold Philippine sugar in the global market, eventually the price will come up and they'll release it, and the price of sugar went down. So in Negros, for example, in a lot of the sugar lands, all this unused sugar, actually that by the 1980s, you can see virtual famine happening all over the region. Second, because Marcos decided that, one way in which you can pay for these visits and trade is to borrow money. One way in which you could continue promoting the expansion of the city of man and infrastructure was to borrow money. Once these revenues began to decline, once the banana and the pineapple were not generating this expected revenues they're expecting, Marcos's technocrats began to use debt. It's like credit card when they started to borrow more and more. Now, what complicated the fact is that, like any Philippine government, even up to now, the collection of taxes is very bad. 60% of revenues actually don't end up in the government pocket. And then the insurgencies, the Moro National Liberation Front insurgents, the MILF insurgents, the NPA insurgencies, made the countryside unstable. So you cannot just sort of, those who, the corporations that were setting up but vegetable exports were having a hard time following what the banana and the pineapple industries did because the NPA was around and they were asking for revolutionary taxation, prompting the military to attack and therefore destabilizing the area. And then you have, of course, the money that Imelda stole. And that's very, wide, there's a right story about that. Such that by 1984, the Philippine reserves was only down to 64 million. Okay. Marcos's technocrats cheated the IMF on this. Didn't tell the IMF until one of the journalists, who is now unfortunately a rabbi Marcos defender, discovered using looking at the garbage cans of the central bank and piecing them all together, found out that we really virtually had no money. In the countryside, there was hunger because of the collapse of the agricultural crops. There was also famine because of stabilization. I have a table actually somewhere which I can share with you later, where this American human rights worker was tracking which areas of the country had the most disappearance, most killings, most arrests, most torture. And the most militarized one was in Mindanao, where the NPA was the strongest, the MILF, the MNLF were there, where the church was really also the most powerful one. Okay. So that was the economic crisis. The second economic crisis was political. Marcos began to get sick of this disease called lupus erythematosus, which apparently is a disease that only used to affect mainly women. So as Marcos became more and more sick, okay, there were factional politics began to spread. There was now a split, and then there was a split in the military, okay, between soldiers fighting and officers fighting in the field, and generals who were getting rich and having their huge mansions created in one of the new golden ghettos in the Philippines called Corinthian Gardens, which actually had an interesting story when we talk about EDSA. And so you actually have reports of commanders saying, well, you're asking us to fight the NPA and the Moros, but you're giving us only 1 month's supply of food. And my cousin then, who was a major, said, they were forced to eat coconut. So there was a split now between military officers and soldiers who said, what are we fighting for? And a few of Marcos's generals who are getting fat, not involved in battle and enriching themselves. The third factor was the growing tension between Marcos and the technocrats. There's a wonderful book by a professor at UP called by Professor Tessa Encarnacion Tadem, who is on the technocrats, and Dr. Tadem and a couple of other academics were able to interview these technocrats. It's worth reading because it showed of how much the technocrats still love Marcos, but began to really hate Imelda for messing up the economy. And then by 1980, something happened. A political counselor at the US Embassy in Manila wrote a memo addressed to the State Department, but also the US Congress, saying, I think we are seeing the twilight of the Marcos dictatorship. Marcos is dying. The communists are spreading. Even the opposition is thinking of bombing Marcos. So there's urban bombing led by people from San Francisco. And that I think we should start talking to the opposition, okay, and thinking about what would happen when the dictator dies. Drove the Marcoses crazy because that report was not only sent to the State Department, the CIA, Defense Department, but also somebody in the US got a hold of it and sent it to the Philippines. And it was in that time we didn't have fax. It was the photocopy revolution. So everybody was photocopying this and distributing it all over the country. And so suddenly people were talking about this 1980 National Security Service, I think, department at the memo, saying that the US should start distancing itself from Marcos. Okay, 2 more minutes. The downfall then, eventually the downfall, by the 1980s, Marcos was in a state of crisis, the economy was down, communists have reached 1 million, the opposition have started thinking not only of fighting Marcos, but also arming themselves. And the worst, what scared the Americans most is that the traditional opposition saying, it's time to talk to the communists. It's time to sit down and figure out how we can work together. The biggest spur, however, was this. 1983 assassination of Benigno Aquino. I was drinking in UP when this happened. And for the first time, what we call the new, instead of the NPA, we call them the NPE, the not new politicized elements, mainly urbans, professional, middle class, people who were not influenced by the left, began to march. So those of us who were from UP and used to, like Susan, used to throwing pillboxes at the police, hanging out with, hiding from the police in slum communities, or suddenly found ourselves marching with perfume ladies from Makati, Mary Nollers and students co-ed from some of the private schools, shouting Marcos down with Marcos and Taglish. But it was a fascinating phenomenon because suddenly Philippine society, at least Manila and the major cities, began to unite. And so what eventually, I guess you guys are familiar with, we can talk about later, is that, you can stop me if I'm stopping, okay? So EDSA happened in '86, which started actually 2 things that we need to remember, that it was a failed coup by colonels who announced themselves as reformists. They're wanting to change Marcos, but were really interested in a military junta, failing in their coup and then retreating to the camps, and then saved by 1 million people, which acted as a defensive shield, saved from the Marines who were flown in from Zamboanga, who were told that they were going to kill communists. And there's another story behind that. EDSA revolution was prompted by the challenge by Mrs. Aquino when Marcos decided to call for a snap election. The interesting thing about it is that Mrs. Aquino's coalition evolved from a coalition mainly of traditional politicians, but by the time EDSA happened, the coup happened, her coalition expanded to militaries, moderate politicians, traditional politicians, but without the left, because the left boycotted it. So people power could have become a real people power if the left joined it, because the left could have balance of the right and the center, the church apparently. So it was a brief alliance. Aquino becomes, Marcos is outed. Auntie Cory becomes the new president, extremely popular, but because of habit, she's elite politician, elite family, and because of the habit that her belief that a constitution, a democratization means free elections, okay, the restoration of Congress, without taking into consideration that a big chunk of the members of our coalitions were elite politicians, military and technocrats, okay, without very few support from people's organization because the left absconded, boycotted the process. Cory actually came to power as a weak president, very little choice. And it was natural that she drifted right. And one of the things Mrs. Aquino did, which still has impact up to now, which will explain why Bongbong Marcos is president, is to make compromises with provincial and local families, wherein we get your children, your fathers, a chance to get elected to Congress, back this new regime. So too bad he passed away early, but Aquilino Pimentel, who was Department of Local Government Secretary, if he were to write his memoir, his son is in the Senate now, he would have included different kinds of compromises that he had to make with politicians who were not sure about their position, politicians who were in the peanut gallery refusing to take sides, but most important of all, politicians who were supporters of Marcos, including the dreadful, okay, and to wrap up, according to Susan, okay, so, Imelda, they steal away everything. What is reported is vast numbers of wealth that ended up here in Honolulu. But the great thing about, one thing people forgot is that the great thing about being in Hawaii is that the Marcoses cannot harass Reagan. If you were to exile Marcos in Washington, D.C., think of Mrs. Marcos calling the White House every day. But they were doing that. And they were planting that such a way that the FBI had to monitor them. They were lonely. Imelda Marcos hated that she had to eat vegetables at one of the markets here, and they went to it home. Okay, so Marcos dies, he goes home. And to wrap up, as Susan said, this is just to give you an idea of how much, in relation to the other corporations, did the Marcos steal and still own, and how much the economy had suffered under the dictatorship of Marcos. That's all. If you have any questions, maraming salamat, dagang salamat, and looking forward to the Q&A. Sorry for extending. Thank you.
Can you imagine Professor Abinales was able to wrap 50 years, 70 years of history into a 22
Well,
minute speech?
you can buy our book. Our book is
Lecture.
coming out. Our book is coming out in Ateneo University Press. It's a Marcos reader. It's not only academics, but journalists, columnists, and it covers from Marcos. There's an article on Marcos and Dovey beams and Marcos and this idea of golden economy, Marcos in the military, and
Yeah, it's
connecting
coming out
Duterte.
this week.
It's coming out the end of the month by Ateneo Press.
Thank you, Jojo.
Okay, salamat, Susan. Okay, bye-bye.
From an academic discussion, I would like to bring us to a more, what would I say? I would probably use the word humane, emotional talk. I would like to welcome now Carol Ojeda-Kimbrough. She is currently a retired grandmother caring for her elderly mother in Los Angeles. She used to teach, and she is a martial law survivor who lost her husband during the martial law years. So now I introduce to you Carol.
Hi, magandang hapon, magandang gabi sa inyong lahat. I want to start by saying thank you to the Filipino Advocates for Justice for holding this important discussion at a time when the newly installed president of the Philippines and his followers are aggressively trying to erase and deny the brutal legacy of the martial law years when his father, Ferdinand Marcos, abolished democratic governance and replaced it with a military dictatorship. Today, 50 years after the actual declaration of martial law, those of us who resisted in the 70s and 80s, and in 86, when Marcos was overthrown by a peaceful revolution and democracy restored, we see ourselves today bracing for more of the same kind of human rights violations. I personally appreciate FHJ and those of you who are joining us today, whether you are a new immigrant or descended from immigrant parents or grandparents, because you understand the impact this will have on you, your families, and most importantly, to our homeland. I was asked to talk about my journey to activism in the Philippines, the personal loss I experienced, and why I moved to the US, and to also share the anti-martial law struggle we waged here in the US from an immigrant's perspective. So here we go. Similar to other activists of the 70s, my journey to activism started out from a sense of altruism that evolved into something more after being given a book written by Amado Guerrero, or the nom de guerre of Jose Maria Sison, the head of the new Communist Party of the Philippines. The book was called Philippine Society and Revolution. It was an introductory reader for activists in search of critical theory. We learned about the three isms: feudalism, imperialism, and bureaucrat capitalism, to explain the root causes of problems in Philippine society. And we also learned about the solution, which is national democracy. I was a senior in high school when the writ of habeas corpus was suspended in August of 1971. I participated in discussion groups at my high school and attended rallies to protest this action, which we considered to be a precursor to martial law. Indeed, Marcos was testing the waters, and in September 1972, when I was a freshman at UP, he declared martial law. School closed for 3 months, and during that time, I became a community organizer in Quezon City, specifically in the slums, or what they call the squatter areas. When school finally reopened 3 months later, I found the campus transformed from an environment of academic freedom to a virtual prison, with buildings surrounded by barbed wire fences and military personnel posted at all entrances. With the increasing repression within the school grounds and outside in the society around me, I and a number of other student activists made a decision to drop out of school and become full-time community organizers. Our political work involved organizing the squatters in Quezon City. The pejorative squatter describes the large number of urban poor who were forced into illegally building shelters on private or public-owned land. Squatters lived under constant threat of eviction, often through military confrontations with the private armies of landowners or the military. This is where I met Rolando Federes, a student and a tailor who lived in one of these shanties. Lando came from a poor family, and he was the first to go to college, where he quickly became politically involved. He joined discussion groups where he sought to understand the roots of his family's poverty, the same relentless poverty that seemed to burden thousands of other Filipino families, and from which there seemed no escape, even as a few privileged families did not suffer the same fate. I fell in love with this man. He was tall, lean, and with dark wavy hair and beautiful eyes. And he apparently felt the same with me. We became a couple. I left the comforts of home to move in with him and with our other comrades in one of the squatters' areas where we were organizing, near the Marikina River. Lando and I would soon learn that we were expecting a child, and as I got close to giving birth, I chose to scale back on my activities. It was becoming more difficult to outrun the military with a bulging belly. My kasamas, my comrades, thought this to be an ideological wavering on my part. Maybe it was, but they could not or would not offer any tangible support to me, and to me, my child would need at least one responsible parent. And Lando, in our discussions, made it clear that his life was with the movement. So I went back home and had my son in 1974 with the help and support of my family. And then the military started visiting my parents' home to question me. They would ask if I knew so-and-so, or try to intimidate me by saying that they have pictures of me at this or that place, and ask what I was doing there. By the end of the visit, they would remind me to just cooperate and tell them what they needed, and they would leave me alone. Meanwhile, the political situation became more repressive, and by now citizens were resigned to the midnight curfew. Military presence was everywhere, and there was a general loss of civil and democratic rights. Faced with increasing threat of arrest, I made the decision to leave the Philippines and move to the US with a plan to return when things cooled off. So in 1975, my son and I boarded a plane for the US to join my parents and siblings. In LA, I sought and found ways to be part of the movement to overthrow the dictatorship and restore democracy in our country. I worked with the Los Angeles Anti-Martial Law Alliance and did organizing work within the Filipino-American community of LA, which at that time was located in East Hollywood, Mid-Wilshire, and the Temple Beverly area, now known as Historic Filipino Town, and also in the South Bay, San Pedro or Carson. I knew that my stay was supposed to be temporary, as my plan was to return to the real struggle in the Philippines and to reunite with Lando. I maintained communication with Lando through an intermediary for security reasons. I sent him pictures of his son, which made him happy, and he was proud of his baby. I dreamt of reuniting with Lando until I received a letter in January of 1977. Kasama, it started. We don't want to alarm you, and we don't know anything for sure. But Lando boarded the train for Bicol last October, and we saw him off at the Tutuban station. The train arrived in Bicol, but Lando and the two women who were traveling with him were not on board. We are working with members of the clergy. Don't worry. The letter was dated January 1977, 3 months after Lando disappeared. There were many speculations about what may have occurred, but my comrades chose to spare me the details until they had more definitive findings. Eventually, a letter would arrive which confirmed what I secretly feared, but would not let myself think. Lando and one of the women, Flora Coronacion, would become victims to a practice that would later be known as salvaging: the disappearance and subsequent summary execution of suspected subversives. The other woman who was with them at the time of the disappearance, Adora Faye de Vera, was the only survivor. In 1986, after Marcos was deposed, I was able to return to the Philippines and arranged to meet with Adora Faye de Vera. She recounted their ordeal, describing how they were arrested and taken to a safe house somewhere in the province of Quezon. There, they were all stripped naked, subjected to various forms of tortures and indignities, including sexual molestation and rape of the women by the soldiers. They were made to sit on large blocks of ice without any clothes on. The women were told to look at Lando's naked body, with the military men laughing taunting them. Sige na, go ahead, take a look. You can't say we're not being fair. And then ordering Lando to masturbate in front of the women. De Vera continued with her story about Coronacion and Lando's fate with their military torturers, saying that after a few weeks, the soldiers took Lando and Flora out of their cell and did not return them at the end of the day. Perhaps knowing that she was looking for her comrades, the head of the unit told her, "Your friends are no longer here. They didn't escape, but you will never see them again." In 1986, a class action lawsuit against the Marcos estate was filed in the courtroom of Federal Judge Manuel Real in the state of Hawaii on behalf of survivors and families of victims of torture, unlawful arrests, disappearances, and salvaging or extrajudicial killings. Adora Faye de Vera provided compelling testimony before Judge Real, but it would take more than 2 decades to get a final decision for the plaintiffs. Each of the 10,000 plaintiffs, the class action plaintiffs, were given $1,000 in compensation for the loss of their loved ones. Let me ask you, is this the value of a person who could be your child, parent, your lover, your partner? $1,000, or in the Philippines at that time, it was 40,000 pesos. I am going to see if I can do this the same way that Jojo was able to do it, as to share this screen. Is this how you do it? Okay, let's see. This is a picture of Rolando. He was born in 1953 and was killed in 1976. It's a very faded picture. It was the only picture his sisters could give me. Poor people didn't have cameras in those days. And there were no smartphones at the time. So this was the only picture his family had, and they were so generous to give it to me. And every year it gets fainter, so I put it in a protective plastic. This is the letter that I received from Attorney Swift, Robert Swift, the first check, $1,000 on February 15, 2011. Remember, the case was filed in 1986. In 2011, the Bantayog ng mga Bayani, which is a monument, museum, and historical research center in Quezon City, which honors the martyrs and heroes of the struggle against the dictatorship, honored the life of Rolando Federes by inscribing his name on the walls of the Bantayog. You can see his name here, Rolando Federes, right below. Actually, I'm going to mention their names now, but I'll talk about it later. Filipino American Silme Domingo and Jean Viernes was, whose name doesn't appear here, but it's in the other side. At that ceremony, this is me with the sister of Rolando. In the center, Delia Federes, and on the left is Amelia Nazareno, who was one of our comrades in Project 4, and who would later on this year, in fact, visit the Bantayog and laid flowers and wreaths at the site where his name was inscribed. I just wanted to show this picture also of the family of Jean Viernes and Silme Domingo, and I think they're joining us in this discussion today. There's Jeline, Bruce, Cindy, Edwin, Mrs. Domingo, Terry, and I think this is Stan Lake, the brother of Jean Viernes. I'm not very familiar with, there are two other men in the back. I think that might be Cindy's son, but I'm not sure. Please correct me for those who know. But this was what happened in 2011 after 1976, so many years after Lando was disappeared and summarily executed. The Bantayog recognized his sacrifice and included his name in the wall of heroes and martyrs. Okay, now how do I unshare? Oh, stop share. Okay. All right. I am now having a difficulty finding. Okay, here we go. So the next, I was also asked to talk about the anti-martial law struggle in the US from an immigrant's perspective. The declaration of martial law in 1972 created an atmosphere of repression in the Philippines and abroad. It divided and caused fear within the overseas Filipino community as well, especially in the US, where the largest numbers of Filipinos reside outside of the country. It is estimated that between 1971 and 1981, more than 15,000 Filipinos left the Philippines or were forced out of the country because of martial law, many of them settling in the US. But the situation in the US was different because here we have democracy. Opposition to Marcos could be carried out openly, even though the Marcos government tried to intimidate and harass anti-martial law activists. In LA, people who worked for the Philippine consulate would follow us at our workplaces, taking our pictures in plain sight, just to intimidate us. But none of these tactics would match the killing of Jean Viernes and Silma Domingo, two Filipino-American anti-martial law activists and union organizers in Seattle, Washington, on orders of Ferdinand Marcos. In the US, as in the Philippines, the Filipino-American community was divided between the pro and the anti-martial law sides. Some were more vocal and active than others. Where did they come from? Where did these anti-martial law forces in the US come from, and who were they? There were two feeder streams for the anti-martial law movement in the US. They came from the Philippines and in the US. From the Philippines, the radicalized university students who went abroad before or immediately after the imposition of martial law, mostly living in the US where they continued their activism. And I see their names, and some of them are here with us in this discussion. You also have exiled politicians and members of the ruling elite. The closing of Congress, arrest, and detention of many traditional politicians forced their expatriation or escape to the US. But their economic and political resources allowed them to fight Marcos from abroad, and they were able to set up newspapers as their propaganda arm. In the US, there were three main factors that converged. The pre-martial law groups, and basically an emerging group of nationalist activists working to expose the role of US imperialism in maintaining neocolonialism in the Philippines. Groups like Kasama, Kapatid, and the Kalayaan Collective met and conducted regular discussion groups. The Asian Pacific American Movement. This is the identity movement among Asian Pacific Islander Americans and struggles around community issues, for example, the I Hotel. Progressive liberal politics of Filipino-American student youth movement that were formed at the annual Filipino People's Far West Convention was another factor. So by 1971 or 72, and with the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus and the impending declaration of martial law, these groups activities culminated in a retreat in Northern California and led to the formation of the National Committee for the Restoration of Civil Liberties in the Philippines, or the NCR-CLP. Martial law was declared on September 21, 1972. And in the US, this coalition, the NCR-CLP, responded, and other organizations were formed to fight martial law in the Philippines. So you have the NCR-CLP, which was the broad coalition of anti-martial law forces. And then you have new organizations that formed, the AMLC, which is the Anti-Martial Law Coalition, which established chapters in various US cities in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, San Francisco, LA, San Diego, and Seattle. This is a broad coalition of anti-martial law forces, and they publish a newsletter called Taliba to counter pro-Marcos media accounts. Another organization is the Movement for Free Philippines, established in Washington, D.C. by displaced Filipino politicians like Raul Manglapus, etc. And they conducted propaganda through their newspaper, the Philippine News, which was edited by Alex Exclamado. The KDP was also established as a left pole to counter the right pole presented by the MFP. And I'm gonna leave that for Rene to discuss. Other left groups that were formed included the Friends of the Filipino People, the International Association of Filipino Patriots, and other independent or left of center groups of media, Philippine Times, the Gore Brothers in LA, and other individuals. They're not necessarily part of organization, but they were very vocal in their opposition to martial law. They were then included in the blacklist by the Philippine government and included UCLA professor Tanya Azores, attorney Lee Tamoria of Hawaii, and Lillian Tamoria, Esther Soriano, Roy Morales of Los Angeles, and Loida Nicolas of New York. If you have anti-martial law forces, of course, you'll find pro-martial law forces. In LA, their work was to discredit us by calling us communists. In community affairs, in community meetings, they would immediately stand up and call us communists, as if that would negate anything we had to say. In LA, the struggle centered around the FACLA, or the Filipino American Community of LA, and Philippine National Day celebrations. The pro-martial law forces included the Consulate, an organization based in South Bay called Conpuso, and some of the community leaders at FACLA. We drew the battle lines everywhere Filipinos were. In general, we held regular demonstrations in front of the Philippine Consulate on Wilshire Boulevard. And the consulate moved many times during this period, always on Wilshire Boulevard, but from east to west and back again. We like to joke that they keep moving to lose us, but we will always find them. We hounded them and followed everywhere they went, and we'd start bringing our placards and start demonstrating again. The AMLC, NCR-CLP, and the MFP conducted joint actions whenever Imelda or Ferdinand Marcos visited the US, or LA in particular, but those were few and far in between. More often, what we did was to do educational or propaganda work where we knew Filipinos congregated. Where do we find Filipinos? Churches. Although many of the activists were not particularly religious, I think we spent more time than many people, many Catholics, we spent more time than many Catholics in churches on Sundays, usually starting with the 8 o'clock Mass until after the noon Mass is over, to disseminate flyers and sell newspapers about the situation in the Philippines. We went to Filipino stores. Every week we delivered Taliba, which, as I said, is the AMLC newsletter, and the Ang Katipunan, which is the KDP paper. We attended events like for the Philippine National Day, and we did Christmas caroling as a fundraiser for political prisoners in the Philippines. How did we do our work at a time when there was no social media, no cell phones, no Facebook? We did it the old-fashioned way. We used phone trees and built upon the concept of concentric spheres of influence, which saw allies and classify as dynamic. And that means we can move them from one sphere to another, that people's commitment was not static. I don't think I have enough time to go over the different spheres of influence, but I'll just quickly go over what they were. It was the core, which is the activists, whose full-time responsibility was day-to-day anti-martial law work. There's the first sphere, second, third, and fourth spheres, whose commitment and ability to participate fluctuated. And then there's the broader public. It's the big universe of people who can be reached through any of the above media. What did we learn in this organizing? Well, for one thing, on organizing politics and policy, the activists of the 70s have not disappeared. Today, we are still active in building the pillars for a more humane community, in civil rights, institution building, higher education, and leadership development. An example is FAJ's previous ED, Lillian Galedo, in nonprofit work, we have Rodel Rodiz, who was in the school board of San Francisco. And eventually, many of us got our diplomas and ended up working or teaching in higher education. I went on to teach undergrad classes about the Filipino immigrant experience and history. We also learned that people have a short memory. The Marcoses were allowed to return to the Philippines, and Imelda and Bongbong were elected in public offices. Imelda became a congresswoman, and Bongbong Marcos became a senator. Enrile Onasan were elected to the Senate, and Fidel Ramos became president. We also learned that people can be manipulated and votes bought. As we commemorate this historic moment in Philippine history, another Marcos is president of the Philippines, having recently met with President Biden of the US at the UN General Assembly in New York. Marcos Jr. and his loyal followers are also trying to revise or erase history, claiming that the country did not suffer, but in fact prospered under the dictator's rule, calling it the Golden Age. I'm gonna let this, okay. Marcos Jr. and his family refused to apologize for their ill-gotten wealth or even acknowledge how he and his family benefited from the martial law regime, saying he was very young during that time, or that the past is past and just move on. For your information, Marcos Jr. was born in 1957, and by 1980, he wasn't a 12-year-old innocent. He was already vice governor of Ilocos Norte, and then governor of the same province by 1983 until 1986, when his father was ousted from his position as president dictator of the country. He was an adult and had full knowledge of what his father and mother were doing to the country. Yet in May of 2022, 31 million Filipino voters swallowed that lie. How is this possible? Finally, we learned that we can make a difference. Events like this are important in our continuing work to prevent people like Marcos Jr. from erasing or revising the impact of martial law on the lives of Filipino people. We need to keep reminding ourselves and each other that once upon a time, our country was ruled by a tyrant and a generation of promising leaders no older than you today were cut down before they could reach their full potential and make their contribution to the country. We made a difference then, we can make a difference now. This event is a good starting point for some of you, while others are already involved in community work with organizations such as the FAJ, the Filipino Workers Center in Los Angeles, and the Mayan in New York. These two are organizations that work with low-wage workers to fight for their labor, health, gender, and immigrant rights. Or Affirm, an anti-imperialist, transnationalist feminist organization. As we speak, Marcos Jr. is in New York, or he may be in DC at this moment, and has been warmly received by President Biden. One concrete thing you can do today is to write President Biden and your congressional representative and senator to defend human rights in the Philippines and to demand the immediate release of Senator Leila de Lima and Adora Faye de Vera. If you remember, she is the lone survivor who testified against the Marcos estate in 1986 and whose courageous testimony made it possible for us to get some measure of justice in the lawsuit. Adora Faye was arrested recently on charges of murder while she was seeking medical attention in Quezon City. I would ask everyone to please do that today. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak before you and share some of my life experience. Maraming salamat, FAJ.
Maraming salamat, Carol. We were in a talk also for the Mayan yesterday, and I know how difficult it is for you. There you spoke about how bringing back the memories and thinking about what happened just tears you up. So we very much appreciate your taking the time to tell us your story again. Henry, we're going into a 3-minute bio break to give people the chance to get food, go to the bathroom, whatever, and then
Yes.
come back with with Ben Boying Pimentel, and then Mr. Rene Ciria-Cruz after. Now, to enter the second part, I'd like to introduce our third speaker, Mr. Benjamin Pimentel. We call him Boying. He was a student activist in the 80s. He's younger than me. So his generation was pre-people power, just before people power. And so Boying is now based in San Francisco. He is a journalist. And so please welcome Ben Pimentel.
All right, thank you, Santi, at maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat. And Santi, want to thank you for promoting me to professor. I've always wanted to be a professor like Jojo. So I am part of the martial law generation. You know, we were called martial law babies. We were children and martial law was declared. The dictatorship defined and shaped my youth, essentially. I was a year old when Marcos became the 10th president of the Philippines. I was 5 when he became the first president to be re-elected in one of the dirtiest elections in the country's history. And I was 8 at the end, when at the end of what was supposed to be his second and final term, he decided that he wanted to stay in power forever. And so he declared martial law, which gave rise to the dictatorship. And I was 21 when we finally overthrew him in 1986. I don't actually have slides to share, but I wanted to share this one for all of you. Can you see it? No, not yet. Share. Maybe not. It's too complicated. But I was going to show a photo of my 21st birthday. which was at a rally march in Bataan around 7-8 months before the fall of the dictatorship. So I need to confess, though, I was thrilled when martial law was declared. I was 8 years old because there were no classes and there were nothing but cartoons on TV. My favorite then was Wacky Races. And I come from a middle class family, and I got a sense that my parents actually welcomed martial law because it meant peace and order. Because it was the end of all the rallies that were happening back then. And essentially, if you're middle class during that time, if you keep your mouth shut and stay out of politics, you'll be fine. And so also my generation was supposed to play an important role in the regime. We were supposed to be the Marcos version of the Hitler Youth, I like to say. I was actually a junior member of the Kabataang Barangay, which was like the youth arm of the Marcos movement, of the Kilusang Bagong Lipunan, his political party. So I grew up learning the songs, hailing the new society. I every September 11, I know it's Marcos's birthday, and I know that Imela's birthday is July 2nd by heart, because the TV news was mainly about them. We were reminded each year about that. But of course, behind the scenes, there was repression, which Jojo and Carol already referred to, and also there was resistance. I'm sure my parents would have preferred their children to keep silent and not be politically involved. Unfortunately, I had two older sisters who went to private all-girls schools, Catholic schools, but were exposed to activism and became very politically active. Jojo already talked about some of the triggers of the protests around that time: the poverty, the repression, the corruption. But beyond that and beyond the Philippines, young people were also rising up. We have the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement were raging in the United States, and the protests against that. There was a big change also in the Catholic world, which included the Philippines. That in 1963, Pope John the 23rd initiated the Vatican II reforms, which essentially the church said being a Christian is not just about praying and going to mass and staying out of trouble with the people in power. It's also about fighting justice. And that unleashed a wave of activism among the priests and nuns, especially in the Catholic and also in the Catholic schools. And that actually, in a way, contributed to the first wave of activism in the Philippines during that time. This is the time when a lot of the Catholic schools were influenced by this view that you have to also be involved in social issues. That's where people like Edgar Hobson, whom I wrote about, they were not radicals. In fact, they were being condemned by the radicals because of their Christian orientation, but they were also pushing for reforms. Edgar was famous for leading a protest at a big wedding party of a very rich Filipino, where it was just so opulent and obscene that they were really they denounced it because of the poverty around that time, around the Philippines during that time. And then that first wave, of course, when martial law was declared, they were arrested, killed, they went underground. Others went into exile. I think you can be talking to Rene Ciria-Cruz later, who was among those who were forced to go overseas. And others went and became silent and gave up politics. Actually, it's interesting. 10 years later, after the Aquino assassination, I would meet people who were very active during the period which is known as the first quarter storm, but who kept quiet during that time, but were returning and becoming more active during that period. Now, we have the second wave of students who were those who entered college in the early 70s. And this includes my sisters, who were politicized when they were in high school and then continued their involvement in college. So this second wave found themselves returning to campuses or entering campuses that were very repressed. There were no student councils, there were no student papers, campuses were militarized, and there were no student organizations. And this is where they had a tough job. They had to break the wall of silence and push back on the militarization of the campuses. So there were very early acts of resistance that were usually very small. A successful rally and I apologize, my reference here is UP in Diliman, but a successful rally at UP back then was to march secretly from the 4th floor of the Arts and Sciences building, which is the main building, to the 2nd floor, yell slogans, and then quickly disperse and hide your placards and streamers and all that, because if not, then you will be arrested by the campus police and the military agents who were then deployed to the campuses. A professor at UP then, Pete Leroy, is an old friend. He passed a few years ago. Said one of the things that they did was to form a karate club, even though he wasn't really into karate or didn't even know anything about karate. But it was just an excuse, a way to get people or to get students organized and for them to meet and talk about what was going on. So the thrust then was to push, to assert, to have student councils and student publications and student organizations to be restored. There were, of course, many arrests. A prominent one was Tito Sarmiento, who was the editor of the Philippine Collegian, and he was arrested. And his own entire staff actually was. There was a big crackdown, and his fellow editors, were arrested and imprisoned, and he died in prison because he had poor health. And if you know of the UP slogan, "Kung di tayo kikibo, sino ang kikibo?" Kung di tayo, I forget the other part. Kung di tayo kikibo, sino ang kikibo? And which is an image that they use also for an issue of the Collegian to protest his arrest and also his death. So that became an iconic symbol of UP. Even my own sister, Nimia Simbulan, who is now head of the PARA, which is the biggest human rights association alliance in the Philippines, was detained for 6 months. For 6 months at Fort Bonifacio, and from 73-74, I was then 9 years old. That's where, if you go back to the Philippines, that's where the Bonifacio Global City is now, which is a posh community. I mean, I hated that because I was 9. It meant Sundays were spent going to the detention center instead of playing with my friends in the streets. But we went through that. Another sister of mine also went underground, and part of my job as a teenager was to wait for a call so I can pick them up at a secret location and take them to our house so they can be with our family. So thank you for those who clarified what the slogan was. And actually, just an additional point to underscore how the U.S. movement, like the civil rights movement, also had an impact on the Philippines. That slogan, "Kung di tayo kikibo, sino ang kikibo," which in English means "if we do not act, who will act," was actually, I believe, from the Black Panthers, which is here in Oakland. If not now, when? O kung di ngayon, kailan? Kailan pa? So the third wave was in the late 70s to early 80s. This is my generation. This is my where I fit in. I caught the tail end of this wave. And by the time I entered college in 1981, protesting was already a way of life on campus. And a lot of the campaigns earlier were already won. Like the UP Student Council was restored in 1980, and also on other campuses. And also when one of the victories then was the restoration of, or earning the right to publish a student publication back then. I was president of the College Editors Guild in 1985, and back then there were still some campuses where the administration was not allowing students to publish their own newspaper, but we were at that time we had the momentum to actually be able to succeed in having students win that right again. But Marcos was still very powerful at that time. This was in the early 80s. Remember, in 1982, he had the state visit where he met with President Reagan, Bush, the Vice President Bush, the first George Bush came to the Philippines and praised him for his adherence to democratic principles. So he was then at the height of his power. There was but the opposition was strong and maybe being tolerated at that time. And then 1983 happened when Ninoy Aquino was assassinated, and that changed everything. when people talk about the fall of the dictatorship, they talk about the struggle as if it just started with the Aquino assassination and culminated in EDSA or the People Power uprising. That's not true. I mean, as other speakers will underscore, there were other mini struggles and mini battles and mini uprising that led to that final confrontation. So I'll end with one point. The Marcos revival was very jarring and very heartbreaking and very mind-boggling, as other speakers have already said, because he won, Bongbong Marcos Jr. won based on lies, based on a denial of what we went through from 72 to 86. And a huge chunk of the population, many of them young people, because of social media, were convinced that the abuse, the killings, and the repression that we knew happened didn't happen. So I want to end by relating this to what's going on in the US in a way. We know how truth and history can be twisted. That we're living through that now, with the 2020 elections and how the January 6th riot is being downplayed and denied by the Trump forces. Even broader than that, of course, I learned only recently that in the South, even the teaching of slavery and what blacks went through was a big issue, and that led to the big campaigns about removing the statues of Confederate generals who were supporting the pro-slavery forces back then. Last summer, my family and I had a chance to visit the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. There was the first memorial to commemorate the ugly chapters in U.S. history: slavery, the lynching of African Americans, the Jim Crow era. Now, here's an interesting note. Slavery was abolished in 1865. The civil rights battles were waged in the 1960s. What's striking was this memorial and this museum were built only in 2018. And that sort of underscores the point that we need to always stress the importance of remembering, of honoring those who fought for freedom in the past. This is already being done, or has been done ever since the fall of Marcos, through the Mantayog ng mga Bayan, which was already mentioned by Carol earlier. And what I hear is that they're struggling financially. So that's one thing in terms of people who want to support efforts to push back on the return of the Marcoses. That's one thing that we can do to support this initiative. I'm going to make a personal plug here. Royalties from my book, UG, An Underground Tale About Edgar Hospital, go directly to that memorial. And of course, that memorial also for Filipino Americans is significant because it honored the first two Filipino Americans to be honored there were Jean Viernes and Silmi Domingo, whom Carol mentioned earlier. Also, there's a new documentary, I'm sure you've already heard about it, 11,103, which refers to the official number of claimants in the law that compensated victims of the Marcos dictatorship. Also featured in that documentary was the plan to build a new martial law museum sanctioned by law, which is supposed to rise in 2023. And that's something that the new government is supposed to implement. Of course, it's going to be a big battle, and that's likely going to be another front on this fight. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Boying. Which leads me, I just want to read two lines. Ironically, they were published last September 21 in the Facebook page of the German Embassy in Manila. And I just want to read the two lines that I found very striking because they are directly related to what Boying said. And I quote, "An important aspect of ensuring peace is the remembrance of the dark and troubled portions of a nation's history. Remembering and learning from the past is the first step in ensuring that such events will never happen again. It is through remembrance, commemoration, and responsible actions that we honor the memories of the victims and achieve justice, peace, and stability." Before I introduce our last speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of both Jeline Avila, who is the sister of Jean Viernes, and Cindy Domingo, who is also the sister of Silme Domingo from Seattle. I think Rene, yes, Carol has mentioned them, but Rene will also touch on them. So I'd like to call on the last speaker, Mr. Rene Ciria-Cruz.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to be a resource person on a period in history that greatly affected Filipinos at home and all over the world. When martial law was declared in 1972, the Filipino community in the United States was still relatively small, but it was growing fast with the influx of the post-1965 third wave of immigration, which continues to this day. And from 1970 to the early 80s, there were only 337,000 Filipinos in the United States. 250,000 of that were on the West Coast. But the post-1965 wave, which included nurses, doctors, and other skilled employables, were coming in. And a lot of them were settling in places like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, where a lot of hospitals, healthcare jobs are also present, and a lot of mid-management type of jobs were available and open to skilled immigrants who could come in and become permanent residents. Although the community was small, the political atmosphere surrounding it, political atmosphere in the world and the United States was vastly different. In Europe, you had the student power movement raising hell. In the United States, you had the anti-Vietnam War movement, the occupation of US campuses. You had the civil rights movement, Black Panthers. The new left, American new left was emerging. So this influenced mainly a lot of the baby boom generation of all the older community on the West Coast who were born after the war. This was the atmosphere in which they were awakening to, and giving them a sense of activism and rebelling against the racism that they had experienced as non-white Americans. There was also a search, because of these awakening, there was a search among Filipino born and raised Americans, young Americans, for the history, the origins of their families and the history of the Philippines. And this is what led them then to the first quarter storm. Because on the other hand, there were also younger new immigrants coming in who had been exposed to the first quarter storm. And even those Filipinos who had preceded them in immigration were aware of what was happening in the Philippines, of the turmoil, the ferment that was happening in the Philippines. So what you had at that time among young baby boomers, both Filipino American born and raised in the United States and new immigrants, essentially you had a left-wing or progressive, broadly progressive, and even left-wing influence. So that before martial law was declared, there were already study groups, both among young Filipino Americans and new immigrants, talking about the Philippines and the Vietnam War and socialism. So that it was no wonder that among the first groups that were organized against the Marcos dictatorship was a few hundred Filipino American and Filipino immigrants who looked at themselves as socialists, who supported the armed struggle of the New People's Army and the Communist Party of the Philippines, who supported the National Democratic Underground. And this was the group that later formed the KDP. When martial law was declared, the day martial law was declared, these members of these study groups from San Francisco, LA, Seattle, New York, Chicago were meeting in San Francisco. And they immediately organized the National Committee for Civil Liberties in the Restoration of Civil Liberties in the Philippines. This is the group that organized the early rounds of protest in the United States against the declaration of martial law. Shortly afterwards, in 1973, Filipino American and Filipino immigrant leftists formed the Katipunan ng mga Demokratikong Pilipino, or Union of Democratic Filipinos. This is partly out of a request from leaders of the Philippine underground to train all left-wing Filipinos here under a single organization, national organization, so that to facilitate their training in organizing and political work. That's why the KDP was formed, both in support of the national democratic struggle in the Philippines and in organizing Filipinos in the United States with a socialist perspective. The movements, but there were other anti-martial law coalitions that would emerge. Okay, so the KDP, for example, organized the later version of the NCRC, of the National Committee for the Restoration of Civil Liberties in the Philippines, by organizing the Anti-Martial Law Alliance in local areas and the Anti-Martial Law Coalition nationwide. This is a broad coalition. This is a coalition with individuals who are not members of KDP, but working with KDP in alliance. There was also later the Filipino Friends of the Filipino People, a group of non-Filipinos in support of human rights and against U.S. support for Marcos. Later on, there would be disenfranchised traditional liberal politicians who were exiled, and they would form the movement for Free Philippines, which would later split after the Aquino assassination with a Ninoy Aquino movement becoming a new organization. But back in 1972, the broad opposition movement's first task, which continued through the years, was to counteract the blanket of fear that the dictatorship exported to the United States Filipino community. The Philippine consulates were turned into spy agencies against the Filipinos. The San Francisco consulate publicized a blacklist of Filipinos and Filipino Americans who are supposed to be subversives. Ironically, this included some reactionary and conservative Filipino American leaders. It just so happened that they were, prominent in the Filipino newspapers. We needed to break this climate of fear through open demonstrations and identifiable spokespersons, through continuing public education forums. Later on, we had a monthly, the Anti-Martial Law Coalition published a monthly one-page leaflet called the Taliba, which analyzed the most current ploys of the dictators. Our newspaper, the Ang Katipunan, openly supported the armed struggle in the Philippines and the National Democratic Underground, and provided analysis, updated analysis of the Philippine situation and the role of the United States. The overall strategy of the KDP was, in terms of the anti-Marcos opposition in the US, the overall strategy is to win over the community against Marcos dictatorship. If that's not possible, to at least keep it polarized so that Marcos could not claim hegemonic support for the Filipinos here. This was an important point to make in relationship to gaining support from the larger community of non-Filipinos. So the movement educated the public on human rights issues and the self-serving U.S. government support for Marcos due to the U.S. bases in the Philippines. And we identified associated the Philippine issue with the anti-war sentiments, the growing anti-war sentiments of the American public. So we sent human rights investigating teams, U.S. academics, congressional aides, lawyers to the Philippines, and then send them on speaking tours in the United States. We also organized information and material support for political prisoners, including Adopt a Prisoner campaign for financial and political and moral support, caroling fundraisers for political prisoners, fundraisers for communities displaced by military operations against the New People's Army. We also set up a congressional task force in Washington, D.C., which will be a conduit for our petition campaigns. Now, we were aware of the U.S. interest in supporting Marcos. The United States investment between 1970 and 1988 totaled $1.6 billion, or more than one-half of the total foreign-owned investments in the country. But what was more important than these investments, the most important assets were the U.S. military bases. Clark, Subic, Mactan Air Base, because these were launching grounds for U.S. military weapons and personnel that were waging the U.S. war in Vietnam. So that the United States wanted these bases to be protected and guaranteed protection, and their guarantor was Ferdinand Marcos. That was his trump card with the U.S. government. So that even liberal Democrats, were hesitant to go beyond lip service to human rights. But still, we continued with work in Congress because it was very important to be used as platforms. The hearings could be used as platforms for human rights education and media exposure. Dividing congressional opinion on the morality of the U.S. propping up the Marcos dictatorship was very important. Materially, this did not lead to any significant gains for us because in the 1970s, U.S. assistance to Marcos increased to just below almost $400 million annually, mostly in military aid. But perhaps the movement's biggest legislative victory was helping defeat the extradition treaty negotiated by Marcos with the United States. Marcos, who publicly later released a list of his targets, headed by Ninoy Aquino, and including less prominent oppositionists like myself. Because of our campaign, eventually the Senate did not ratify this treaty. Meanwhile, apart from the opposition, organizing the opposition movement against the dictatorship, the KDP also organized the Filipino community on Filipinos, on the issues that Filipinos are facing here. We were socialists, so we conducted national and local community-based campaigns against discrimination and for civil rights of all, against discrimination at work and schools, for curriculum reform, so that Filipino American history would be included, and Asian American history could be included in California's curriculum, against language and accent discrimination of Filipino employees, against local police abuse, against licensure discrimination of Filipino nurses and doctors, supporting the Narciso Perez nurses Narciso and Perez who were wrongfully arrested for and scapegoated for the deaths in the Veterans Hospital in the Midwest. Now, we took up these issues for their own sake, and because we were socialist oriented, that these are problems the community faced and they need to be addressed. The community needs to be organized around them. But we were also aware that these advocacies would give our work of raising organized opposition to the Marcos dictatorship stronger legs to stand on within the Filipino community. Because in our belief, Filipinos who are awakened and activated against injustices here most likely would also readily awaken to the injustices at home and vice versa. Now, to touch briefly on Silmi and Jean, Silmi Domingo and Jean Viernes, local officers of the KDP in Seattle, leaders of the KDP in Seattle, and officers of the mostly Filipino local 37 workers in the International Longshore Workers Union. They were assassinated by Filipino thugs on June 1st, 1981 in the Union Hall. I think the initial question then, immediately after the assassination, was that, well, why would Marcos bother with two local activists in Seattle when there are other opposition hotspots in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and LA, with prominent leaders like Raul Manglapus, Gerson Alvarez? Well, it's important to look at the backstory of this. The assassinations resulted from an intersection of the local reform campaign in the union that Jean and Selmy were leading. They were trying to rid the union of corruption in the dispatch of workers to the canneries and against the gambling racket of gangsters in the cannery. And these, the corruption and the racket was headed by the union president, Tony Barroso, the townmate of Marcos. Before the murders, Silmi and Jean won an important victory in the ILWU International Convention in Hawaii to support the Philippine labor movement against the repression of the Marcos dictatorship. This was a key victory because they won over the influential, they won the resolution from the ILWU over the opposition of influential Filipino union leaders in Hawaii, very influential in Hawaii, who are also mostly Ilocanos. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, from the point of view of US intelligence, in this case, US naval intelligence, which we later found out was the one responsible for monitoring political activists from the Philippines on the West Coast. From the point of view of the US intelligence, the ILWU was a powerful West Coast union with a progressive background capable of disrupting docks and Pacific shipping. In addition, Jean, shortly before he was killed, visited the Philippines to meet with the Kilusang Mayang Uno, the militant labor federation in the Philippines at that time, to coordinate possible campaigns with us, and also to turn over some $2,900 from the KDP to the underground, not necessarily to the KMU, to the underground. Later, we learned from Freedom of Information Act documents from the FBI, their intelligence said we turned over $290,000, which obviously we didn't have. That's why shortly later in that following months, Ferdinand Marcos cracked down on the KMU as he announced publicly that, quote, "We know you are getting a lot of money from abroad." So those are the intersections. Now, all the killers of our comrades, the hoodlums under Barroso, were convicted, and so was Barroso. But the Marcoses had to be pursued through a civil suit. The Committee for Justice for Domingo and Viernes, the lawyers for this Committee for Justice, were able to track down as evidence the source of the payoff to the killers. It was an intelligence fund run by a San Francisco doctor who is now dead, and a Marcos supporter, Leonilo Malabed, and his townmate, who was later charged with laundering $75,000. The record of this slush fund was among the boxes of papers confiscated from the Marcoses at the Honolulu airport when they arrived as exiles. The Marcoses were found guilty of wrongful death and had to pay the Domingo and Viernes families $23 million in damages. And Jean Viernes and Silmo Domingo are the only US-born and raised Filipino-American martyrs in the bantayog ng mga bayani in the Philippines. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rene. That brings to a conclusion our 4 speakers, but we'd like to, we have just a handful of questions, and I'd like to read them and yeah, direct them to whoever was being asked the question. Jojo, Professor Abinales, the question is, can you imagine a second EDSA revolution scenario building up or climaxing in the light of today's social media age?
No. Unfortunately, not. Remarkably, the Philippine system is stable. It's not stable because government is working. It's stable because different regions and provinces of the country are controlled by political families. Over 80%, 85% of local provinces and regions are now controlled by political families. That's just fantastic image of it is Bongbong, Martin Romualdez, and the son Sandro Marcos, in New York. Second is the military has been co-opted. I mean, you don't have to wage schools now because after you retire, you have a place in a government corporation. Number 3, I think the left has not recovered from the crisis of '86. And it's complicated by the fact that because of the killings inside the Communist Party in the late '80s, one of the things that have been paralyzed are the urban lowland organizations of the party. Okay. The NPA is still there, but according to my friend in Mindanao, they've been suffering from COVID, which limits their movement. The leadership is old and retired. They're really old, and as they get old, they go down from the mountains. And if you follow the last 4 years, there's been a series of elimination of cadres of the Communist Party who are above 70s. Number 4, the church is compromised. One of the things that President Arroyo, Gloria Arroyo, was famous for was undercutting the democratic sector of the church by bribing the bishops. So the bishops now are actually pro-government. And the one thing I found out every time I go into Mindanao House is how increasingly the clergy is not only anti-Muslim, but also pro-Duterte. So they have ceased to become defenders of people's rights. And finally, if you go and if in the Philippines today, if you want to run for political office, you cannot run a campaign without asking the drug lords and the syndicates to help finance your campaign. So like President Arroyo's ally, the Pinedas of Pampanga, before they became notable in people in Congress, they were running a numbers game. And of course, think of the longest living warlord in the Philippines, Luis Chavez Singson, rose to power, allegedly killing his patron while the patron was having his communion in the 60s, and now owned the franchise of the Miss Universe country. Unfortunately, no EDSA. And that is the biggest irony that we face now. If you were to fight for an EDSA, it has to start at the local level. It's not a national thing. Sorry, bad news.
Thank you, Jojo.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Also, I think one of the big factors, if you recall Boying's presentation, significant number of Filipino, I think a large portion of the Filipino population today, Filipino Gen X, Y, and Zs, of course, did not directly experience the abuses of martial law.
Mhm.
So the basis for retaining the material basis for retaining the memory is very weak.
Yeah.
So that's
yeah.
one factor.
Let me just add, like 48% of the voters in May elections were between ages 18 to 40. So the 40-year-olds were born in 1986, 85, 86.
Mhm.
They've never experienced Marcos. They've never experienced EDSA. And this is the one thing that people tend to forget. When Imelda ran in 1992, okay, if her vote for president, if Imelda and Danding Coangco merged their vote together, this is according to Manolo Quezon back home, that would be 38%. You need 39% of voters, voting voters to win the presidency. Okay, so if Imelda and Danding did not try to kill each other, or did not hate each other in 1991, after Cory Aquino, we would have President Imelda Marcos probably, or Danding Coangco as president. So it's a very complicated process, and so therefore, I think Boying, Rene are right. The more we write about the stories, the more we bring them out, the more people will then realize what monster is in front of them. Thank you.
Rene, there's a question. In effect, the assassination of Viernes and Domingo was an action of a foreign government against US citizens. What did the US government do?
It was very hard to get any information from the US government. Okay. The Marcoses, okay, the killers had to go through the justice system in the United States, in Seattle, which is still working. And through that, they were convicted and sentenced to life without parole. And they all died in jail, in prison. But to go after Marcos, it required a non-criminal lawsuit from the families of the victims for wrongful death. And that was won, and they were awarded $23 million. But the United States government essentially it was not cooperative. And without the Freedom of Information Act, I doubt that we will get a lot of evidence. Even the classified informations released by the FBI had a lot of blacked out sections. So you had to read between the lines. Our lawyers had to read between lines. And the seizure of documents from Marcos when they arrived in Honolulu, as I said, was very important.
Yeah, another question also for Rene, from a proud Filipino-American member leader of the SEIU Local 1000. And the question is, I know the Filipino-American community was divided pro and anti-Marcos, but was there also that kind of division in the Filipino-American labor movement with respect to Marcos?
I think there was, at least in the ILWU, as I mentioned before, and other kasamas who were watching this, who were active in the union movement. Honolulu has a lot of has a lot of Ilocano immigrants. People call it Ilocoslovakia. So the ILWU, which is a very big union and a strong union in Hawaii, the Filipinos had a lot of influence, and many of them tried to defeat the resolution that Jean Viernes and Silmi Domingo was proposing to the international, so that the internationals would send investigating teams to the Philippines and render all kinds of support. That's why their victory is very important. So there was that division that I'm aware of.
Mr. Pimentel, the question is, well, it wasn't specified for you, but I think you are in a better position to respond to this. How did folks distribute information that opposed Marcos? What tactics did they use?
Leaflets, statements. Some people here may still be familiar with the mimeograph machine, which is the well, my sister, I talked about getting arrested, getting captured the first time. She made a mistake of keeping one or keeping several in her school books, and that's how she got arrested the first time. It was very hard then because this was before the web. Meetings were set via phone, and if you cannot change it or you cannot make adjustments before the scheduled time. In terms of the information, newspapers, the Philippine Collegian, I'm actually proud to say because I came from there, played a very critical role. The Collegian was not shut down when martial law was declared. It survived, but it was harassed constantly. Although at some point it became played the role before the so-called mosquito press, which is the term used for the opposition press. Later, sometime in the late 70s, but before then, the Philippine Collegian and other student newspapers played a critical role, and occasionally would get shut down. And the most sure way for a newspaper to be shut down is if you question Marcos's war medals. That sort of is a very sensitive topic for the dictator. The dictator and the dictatorship is to question whether he was indeed a bemedaled World War II hero, which was eventually proven to be a hoax.
Can I add something to the question about the union?
Yes,
So
please.
aside from the ILWU, there was also a division among Filipinos in the United Farm Workers Union. For example, Andy Imutan, a labor leader in the among Filipinos, convinced Cesar Chavez to visit the Marcos in the Philippines because it would be a plus for him among Ilocano members of the union. He was openly opposed by Philip Veracruz, another top union leader in the Filipino Farm Workers Union. So there was that division too.
May I
Can I add to?
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
Carol.
Go ahead, Jojo.
Just quickly lang, apart from what Boying said, the parish priest in Mindanao actually played a real role in sharing reports of torture and violations because you cannot touch them when they do sermon. In the mosque, it was the imams who came back from mainly from places like Afghanistan and Egypt, who then conveyed in Arabic or in local languages messages of justice. So it was very important for Gloria Arroyo to actually undercut the priest because in rural areas, that's how they get the news. That's how you politicize people. So just to add to that.
Yeah, and I wanted to add that another tactic that was used by the youth was what we called ODOP, which was Operation Dikit, Operation Pinta, which means we mimeographed or printed. Do you people still know cartulina? Oh, okay, it's what you call butcher boards now. We would print messages on butcher boards and use homemade paste from flour or not cornstarch.
Yeah.
And use them to use the cornstarch paste to paste them on public walls, and as well as paint slogans against the Marcoses in walls. And the most popular slogan at the time was MHDT, which meant Marcos, Hitler, Dictador, Tuta. Tuta being puppy. a copy of the United States. So rallies were often started with the slogans Marcos, Hitler, Dictador, Tuta. Carol, there's a question here. What do you think will return under Bongbong Marcos?
Wow. Well, we're seeing it already. First thing is, I mentioned Adora Fedevera, the only survivor and witness who testified at the court in Hawaii. And because of her, we were able to get justice, some form of justice. But what happened? Very recently, she was arrested on charges of murder and attempted murder. When she went to get medical treatment in Quezon City, they brought her back to Iloilo, put her in prison, and she's denied medical care. And this is because I really believe that it's because of her testimony that this is kind of payback, and because it meant how many millions of dollars from the Marcos estate that were distributed to the claimants. I can see more of that happening. Human rights violations under Duterte is being followed by more human rights violations with Marcos and Sara Duterte. I can see it. It's starting. But I wanted to also add, a question about how did we conduct propaganda work during the Marcos years, the first Marcos years. And it's really, we had to be very creative because the print shops were closed. We couldn't access them. And those that were open wouldn't do it because they could get arrested too. So we had to be creative. And someone mentioned using mimeographs. And for those of us in the community, we also didn't have access to mimeographs. So we would use silkscreen as a way of making copies. And today everyone has a computer, but back in the day when we had manual typewriters, the way to start the stencil is to remove the ribbon, and you had to type it on the stencil. And we used the sole of the chinelas to make copies in the silk screen. And some of the other creative ways, we did ODOP as well. But at this one, I think the PETA will get mad at us, at me, because sometimes when we'd go to the churches and we'd, gather the pusakal, the feral cats, and we'd tie anti-Marcos propaganda around them, and then set them free, and they would run, and they had all these Marcos, Hitler, Dictador, Tuta signs on them. Or we'd let go of balloons. We'd tie the signs in the balloons and let them go inside churches. One time I went to a packed movie house showing a movie with Nora Aunor. And I had propaganda in my hand, and I threw it up in the air and said, free pictures, ni Nora. I threw it up, and everybody just started grabbing it. And then I ran. But what it said was, it was propaganda against Marcos. So we had to be creative in getting the message out, because every legal means of propaganda was, we lost access to them. So that's what I wanted to add, is how we had to become creative.
Well, are there any last words that our speakers would like to share? Or
I would like a couple of words. I think what we're seeing, the Marcos won, Marcos and Sara Duterte won, and that's on the basis of an alliance between these two. politically powerful families from two regions in the Philippines. But what that would represent, on the one hand, is the Duterte legacy of trying to circumvent constitutional protections and guarantees, the use of the law as weaponizing the law, the restrictions on the press. So that's on the one hand, is the legacy that most likely Sara Duterte would represent and stick to. Meanwhile, on the Marcos side, there's a bad cop and a good cop drama taking place right now. The president tries to appear magisterial and, business as usual. He has a very reputable cabinet, especially the economists. He will always talk about unity and unity this, unity that. The bad cop is his sister Aimee, who makes running commentaries against critics of the past, or critics of the Marcos family. She even financed this movie production made in Malacanang, and apparently she's preparing another one, mainly to whitewash the past and make Filipinos move on, so-called, and forget what happened. So you have right now, for now, the Marcoses are really trying to normalize, be a normal presidency, with somebody playing the bad role, the hit gal, and Sara Duterte representing the legacy of the Duterte, the authoritarian tendency, the Dutertes. That she wants a sizable amount, a budget amount, for confidential budget for the Department of Education. And no one knows what that confidential budget is going to be spent for. So these are the two trends that are coming together in this new administration.
Before,
Okay, go ahead. That's it.
I also wanted to add, clearly picking up on what Rene said, this is becoming what sort of positive is this is becoming a cultural war. I mean, I know artist friends of mine are getting mobilized. You have the films that have come out. Joel Lamangan, who is a friend and veteran artist and film director, has already said he will come up with his own, and he's already working on his own film, and there are others. So in a way, that's a positive sign, because that's also a strength of the movement against the dictatorship in the 70s and 80s. The cultural aspect was very strong, and clearly, yeah. And speaking of creativity, and I thought Rena's point to you, Santi, about theater. I mean, one of the tactics that was used to underscore the creativity back then was invisible theater, where you ride a jeep and you have a conversation with a friend about the dictatorship, about the Marcoses, and it's a pretend conversation, but it's a way of educating people in the jeepney about the dangers or about what was going on back then, which is very creative. I had friends who did that to me, and I didn't know what was going on, but they were actually already playing a role. And clearly, the groups like PETA and street theater and the movies, and Lino Broca was a very prominent figure in the opposition movement, and his films were very critical in educating Filipinos about what was going on. So that's, in a way, is what exciting about this. It become a cultural. It's sort of like the memory counteroffensive was started, with the documentary of 11,103, which is I highly recommend it. It's being shown all over the U.S. now, and also in the Philippines, and it just captures what happened before and connects it perfectly to the rise of Bongbong.
yeah, and not to forget, way before flash mobs became an in thing, the UP Repertory Company was already doing street theater with, with only 2 or 3 people out in the streets. And yeah, I think you can probably call that the precursor of the flash mob. Anyway, before.
Okay, wait, can I just be a
Yes.
killjoy here?
Yes,
The
please.
problem with this remembering thing is everybody is thinking of martial law from the perspective of the capital. None of you have thought about martial law as being determined in Mindanao. Think of Duterte. None of you anticipated Duterte. It's because a lot of people, including those remembering Mindanao, martial law, has forgotten what happened in the South. 50,000 people by 1975 were killed. 1 million refugees. You can still see Moros in Sabah and Moros in Baguio. I've been interviewing a lot of these MNLF veteran women. Some of them trained in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Their stories haven't been told. You want to win a war against the Marcos II, you cannot forget the South, because the South is the more determined thing. And this is the irony of it. None of the people in Manila and even this country is interested in doing research in the South, getting the stories of imams, Muslim men and women who fought in the 70s. And so I'll be the killjoy for this. As long as people like Duterte control the narrative from the South, nothing will change in the Philippines. This is just me being from Mindanao, but this is also from me getting irritated with the fact that when they talk of resistance against Marcos, you talk as if nothing happened in the peripheries of the nation state. That's all I'm adding.
Thank you, Jojo. And that's a very important thing to note. Maybe something that future young historians would want to take note of.
Yeah, they have to go to Mindanao, so they have to learn Maguindanao and household and Visayan. So I doubt this will happen here from here. I doubt it will happen from here. So I'm sorry, I'm a killjoy on these things. Okay, just to agitate people.
Henry, please take over. Oh, before you do, I would like to do my personal thank you to the 4 speakers we had, Professor Abinales, Carol OK, Boying Pimentel, and Mr. Rene Ciria-Cruz. We thank you for the wealth of knowledge that you have shared with us, and we thank you for giving us your time. And we hope that the listeners today have learned from what they heard from you, and we hope that it will instill a desire to learn more and to participate. Thank you. Henry.
And we thank you again for joining us. Thank you to our speakers for all that wealth of knowledge and information. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your Friday night and the weekend. So thank you all.